wish to acknowledge that we are together here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I also, on talking about Indigenous land, because they've never ceded, I have started to, when I write my address, mine is Coleroy 2097 Guringai, because I'm on Guringai land. And I encourage you to do the same when you are giving your postal addresses. I'm going to talk tonight a bit about, try to explain a little bit about the who, the why, and the how of cruelty in politics. And I think that a lot of you will already know much of what I have to say, but I hope that I can open up this a little further. The nature of human cruelty is extremely complex, and so this evening I'm sharing with you just some insights that have enlightened me. For years, like many activists and decent people, in the face of blatant injustice, I was utterly baffled by the question, how do the perpetrators sleep at night? I had no satisfactory answer until last year when I read Liam McLaughlin's article, No Shame, the science behind why most Australians feel okay about tormenting asylum seekers. It set me on a path that helped me to understand the indifferent cruelty of the Turnbulls, the Netanyahus, Obamas, Trumps, Hitlers, Duttons, Merkels, Blairs, and their ilk, past, present, and future. For activists, the truth is the ultimate weapon against the evil of injustice. We can't achieve justice with an illusory or ignorant mindset. Personally, the prime delusion that limited me had its source in my Christian upbringing, where I was brainwashed to believe all God's children are fundamentally good and yet naturally violent. Go figure. This perspective on the human condition is a handicap. No longer do I believe either premise. The proof for me that people, with exceptions, are not naturally violent is the endemic PTSD in military veterans, which seems not to stem from being close to one's own death, but from one's immoral participation in the hell of war. Last month I watched National Bird, a documentary on 3 whistleblowing military operators in the US drone program. Heather Lindbaugh, a drone imagery analyst, had never been in a war zone, but suffered PTSD from killing up close and personal from afar. And the proof that not all people are fundamentally good is all around us, especially in governments. McLaughlin's article shows the how of cruelty and evil in politics. He cites Stanford University Professor Emeritus of Social Science and Psychology, Albert Bandura's theory of moral disengagement, which outlines the many ways moral codes can be disabled to avoid the negative feelings like shame and guilt normally associated with behaving immorally. In a nutshell, the first stage is moral justification, turning the immoral into the honourable, like cruelty to asylum seeker hostages is justified to end people smuggling or preventing deaths at sea. Moral justification is also enhanced by the use of euphemisms, such as the names of Israel's vicious operations against Palestinians, Protective Edge, Pillar of Defence, Brother's Keeper. The second is minimising, hiding, or ignoring consequences. Media is, in this regard, an effective tool. Australia controls media access to offshore detention camps and threatens whistleblowers with imprisonment. John Lyon's book, Balcony Over Jerusalem, exposes the Israeli Zionist control of international media and its targeting of an endangered species, journalists with integrity. The third is dehumanising and blaming the victim. Asylum seekers are illegals, Palestinians are terrorists, and BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions supporters, are anti-Semites out to destroy Israel. The above strategies lead to a displacement or a diffusion of responsibility. McLaughlin explains this as, people don't feel personally responsible when many others are involved. This happens at the governmental level where group decision making is at play. Researchers have found that people act more cruelly as part of a group. Conversely, where everyone is responsible, no one feels responsible. At the broader level, this is known as the bystander effect. The more witnesses to a tragedy, the less likely any single person will intervene. Personally, I think the bystander effect in the general public is due mainly to fear of authority and fear of speaking out that began in the education system from kindy onwards. It produces establishment clones rather than independent thinkers that dare to challenge injustices. It is safer to swallow the sugarcoating lies of authorities than to stand for truth. But we know it isn't safer. As for political bystanders, such as Western governments that have stood by for decades, watching Israel's cruel war crimes perpetrated against the indigenous people of Palestine, they are led by the masters of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. I'm so nervous, excuse me. Now this led me to the who and the why of cruelty and evil. I had misunderstood that Arendt's banality of evil referred to normal people finding themselves perpetrating evil, like poor Eichmann following Nazi orders to exterminate Jews, Roma, homosexuals and dissidents. However, reading clinical psychologist Andrew Lobachevsky's Political Ponerology, great book, A Science of the Nature of Evil Adjusted for Political Purposes, it was an eye-opener, a rational epiphany, in fact, giving my new viewpoint a coherent edge. Ponerology, Lobachevsky explains, comes from the Greek poneros, evil. And he explains that his study of narcissism led to the study of psychopathy, which he says afflicts 4% of the population and is 10 times more likely among males. 4% of 24.6 million Australians is almost 1 million people. That might explain the Liberal voters. Now, here is Lobachevsky's description of a psychopath. Imagine, if you can, not having a conscience, none at all. no feelings of guilt or remorse, no matter what you do, no limiting sense of concern for the well-being of strangers, friends, or even family members. Imagine no struggles with shame, not a single one in your whole life, no matter what kind of selfish, lazy, harmful, or immoral action you had taken. And pretend that the concept of responsibility is unknown to you. Accept as a burden others seem to accept without question, like gullible fools. Now add to this strange fantasy the ability to conceal from other people that your psychological makeup is radically different from theirs. Since everyone simply assumes that conscience is universal among human beings, hiding the fact that you are conscience-free is nearly effortless. You are not held back from any of your desires by guilt or shame, and you are never confronted by others for your cold-bloodedness. The ice water in your veins is so bizarre, so completely outside their personal experience, that they seldom even guess at your condition. In other words, you are completely free of internal restraints, and your unhampered liberty to do just as you please with no pangs of conscience is conveniently invisible to the world. Lobachevsky points out that psychopaths seem to have in abundance the very traits most desired by normal persons. They can come across as possessing smooth self-assurance. They can be charismatic, likable, charming, intelligent, alert, impressive, confidence-inspiring, and a great success with the ladies. And morally, they can talk the talk, but don't walk the talk. Remind you of anyone? Oh, well, my first thought was Turnbull. And just on that, you know, when he wore his brown leather jacket, I really believed, oh, he'd be great as Prime Minister. And then he did this switch as soon as he became PM, and people and the media keep saying, oh, he's been forced to drop his principles. But I seriously believe now he never had those principles in the first place. Never. Yes. They can also be arrogant, manipulative, cynical, exhibitionistic, sensation-seeking. Swearing an oath means nothing. Machiavellian, vindictive, enjoy making people suffer, efficient machines, and out for their own gain. They attribute love and status to themselves, seeing themselves as highly worthy and very, very important. Psychopaths can be among your friends, could be your partner. They belong to all professions, and Lobachevsky states, quote, politics is no exception, and by its very nature would tend to attract more of the pathological dominator types than other fields. Lobachevsky wrote at the time of the Bush Reich, warning that it seems that the United States in particular, and perhaps the entire world, will soon enter bad times of such horror and despair that the Holocaust of World War II will seem just like a practice run. 20 years later, his words are beginning to feel prophetic. Of course, there are people with consciences who enact... Who? Lobachevsky. Yeah, I think.
Come on.
Of course, there are people with consciences who enact cruelty driven by fear, obedience, ambition, greed, insecurities, mental illness, etc. and they are the ones that are manipulated by the tactics of moral disengagement. Blavatsky presents the biological, that is, the nature origin of psychopathy, but aberrant behaviour can be instilled by nurture en masse in a nation. In Israel, pathological cruelty and moral disengagement is a national culture. With regard to Israel's brutal occupation of Palestine, decent people scratch their heads and ask, why do the Israelis behave like Nazis? Or, why having suffered the Holocaust, do Israelis make Palestinians suffer? They are important questions, and the answer is shocking and distressing. I don't know of any civilized nation that inflicts a brutal regimen of mind torture on its population. From childhood, Israelis are sealed in a glorified military bubble in which they are programmed to peer anxiously at a hostile world that supposedly hates them and is raring for another Holocaust. The indoctrination of victimhood of Israeli children is torture, pure and simple. It is child abuse. Torture is generally held to be the intentional infliction of severe mental or physical pain or suffering by or with the consent of the state authorities for a specific purpose. The purpose in this instance is the preparation of Jewish kids for universal conscription from 18 to 21 that bolsters unreserved support for and the execution of the illegal occupation, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Victimhood indoctrination, combined with crazy-making racism, exploitation of the Holocaust, biblical myths, Jewish supremacism and militarism is integral to the education system. Reuters pointed out a grade 4 Israeli school book that said, Israel is a young country surrounded by enemies, like a little lamb in a sea of 70 wolves. Israel has purposely elevated the Holocaust into a religion, and its greatest hypocrisy is the brutal concentration camp of Gaza, now in its 11th year. Western government bystanders actively protect the sanctity of the Holocaust, but are silent on the collective punishment and suffering of Gaza families. Israel's sole perversion is clear when you try to consider what goes on in young soldiers' minds when they prevent an ambulance from reaching someone they have wounded and then mercilessly watch the person bleed to death. In a healthy society, people immediately follow their instinct to help someone who is hurt and call an ambulance. In Israel, blocking ambulances is a systematic practice of one-by-one genocide. Or view the public outcry against the arrest, trial and detention, a mere 18 months, of Army paramedic Elon Azaria, who cold-bloodedly shot a wounded Palestinian lying unarmed on the ground. In a normal society, such violent fanaticism would be condemned as animalistic and criminal. Yet, fittingly, Azaria is hailed as an Israeli hero. Every Israeli's mental and spiritual health is under siege. Enmeshed in abuse, the abused easily crosses over to the dark side and becomes the Nazi. Even here, there is hope. Indoctrination can be reversed. And we have to find avenues of reconciliation and solidarity between Palestinians and the 90% of Jews with a conscience, so that a one state of civil and political equality can emerge. So what can be our response to cruelty? I now understand that psychopathy is natural, like some people are born with dyslexia or born with a low or high IQ, and that there is individual variation in the range of psychopathic behaviour from mild to extreme. Regarding activist strategies, Lobachevsky urges us to enter into moral reflection, sharpen our reasoning faculties, understand our adversaries, trust our instincts, and we must keep both abhorrence and fear under control. With psychopaths, I now know it's a waste of time to appeal to their conscience or morality, to a non-existent better nature. Their Achilles heel is their ego and self-interest. One can pander to their ego or ridicule it. Think of Trump or Turnbull. Dutton is another species. Notwithstanding, accountability is our principal target. Lobachevsky hopes that his research will enable us to overcome evil through an understanding of its nature, causes, and development. He reminds us it is very important to keep in mind that this influence comes from a relatively small segment of humanity. The other 90-some% of human beings are not psychopaths. Ultimately, he believes that difficult and laborious times give rise to values which finally conquer evil and produce better times. I conclude on a positive note. What we know, and psychopaths don't get, empathy plus action is power, as is compassion plus action, as is truth plus action. Thank you.